Hello, and welcome to another episode of Treasury Talks. Today's discussion will center on a very relevant and significant topic that the country is finally having an open and sincere examination on: racial inequality, specifically on economic opportunities and financial security. It is clear that there is an unlevel playing field when it comes to access to things like banking, fair lending, and investment opportunities for persons and communities of color. Here in Delaware, a special subcommittee on economic opportunity within the African American Task Force has been having a very robust conversation on this topic. My guest today, Vonetta Young, recently participated as a panelist on this subcommittee. Vonetta has a strong background in the financial services industry. She started off in small business development and then went on to work for one of the country's largest private equity fund of funds. She was one of only a handful of people of color in this industry, and soon grew frustrated and decided to do something about it. She now owns her own consulting company that assists clients on investment readiness and fund formation through helping emerging private equity and venture capital fund managers raise capital confidently and successfully. Vonetta, I am thrilled that you are joining me today. I would love to hear more about the work that you do and how you got there and truly why it's important.
Absolutely. Thank you, Madam Treasurer, for having me. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here. So the work that I do is essentially arming particularly women and people of color who are starting their first private equity or venture capital fund to be impressive as they're approaching institutional investors, not unlike the one that I used to work for. My start in financial services is a little bit circuitous. I was an English major and creative writing focus in undergrad. And as I went through my career, I realized I wanted to do something that was going to be a little bit more quantitatively challenging, but also really impactful in society. And I wound up going back to business school to get my MBA. And while I was in business school, I interned at the Small Business Administration, like you alluded to, in the SBIC program. And there are actually a lot of emerging managers who get their start by getting an SBIC. And it is just a really phenomenal program that introduced me to the concept of private equity, but also some of the inequities that I wasn't familiar with. And after I graduated, I moved to New York and worked at a private equity fund of funds. And like you said, I really saw very much firsthand the sort of either lack of opportunity, lack of representation, and sort of additional scrutiny that I found that many of the women and POC-owned funds went through. I did in fact keep a post-it of the number of GPs I met with who were people of color that I kind of kept on the side of my desk so no one could see it. And over the course of 2 years, I met with only 3 Black men. I met with no Black women. I met with 1 or 2 Latinas, and I was extremely impressed to have done that. I did meet with several white women, but over the course of it, I was just really distraught to see that there just weren't a lot of folks who looked like me or had a similar background who were coming into the doors of the firm that I worked for. My firm was very well respected in the industry and was definitely one of the go-to firms that I figured all great private equity firms would have visited. And so I left my job to pursue a creative writing project, but when I finished it, by then my husband and I moved back to DC where we live now. And I got to thinking about, what was the impact that I wanted to make in financial services again. And I realized that it was that I wanted to make sure that people were prepared for the rigors that they were going to experience when they were going to these larger institutional investors. Some of that comes down to very basic business planning of folks who are sort of more focused on doing deals might not necessarily think about the fact that they're also building a company and that investors are in fact investing in their company, not necessarily in their deals. And then working with them on their storytelling and really making sure that they're prepared for that due diligence process. So I very much enjoyed the work that I've done. It's been a little over a year now that I've been doing it very actively. And I'd like to think that I've made somewhat of an impact so far, but got a ways to go, of course.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's always opportunity for improvement, which is why I love, hearing from you. And again, I think about, what are some of those barriers that women and people of color are currently facing in getting their start in banking or the financial sector? And how can we as a society encourage more engagement within these populations to lower or remove some of those barriers?
It comes down to this perception of risk. I think from say undergraduate recruiting all the way up to, so people who are essentially my clients who will be approaching a pension fund. There's this perception that because folks might lack a track record, that they're not necessarily capable of doing it just because they haven't shown proof of having done it in the past. And while I totally understand that, and I approach the work that I do now as very much as that more conservative fiduciary limited partner, I do recognize that that's not necessarily the attitude of a fiduciary. That is an attitude of bias. So there are a lot of ways to say, okay, just because this person hasn't managed, several $1 billion before, what is the analogous experience that they have? If this is someone who has been doing similar deals, you can pretty much safely assume that they're going to continue to be successful in doing those deals. And I think even in terms of, say, undergraduate recruiting, there is the sense of, I don't know if they've done this before, if they didn't go to the business school, or if they were, someone like me who was an English major, but that doesn't mean that they're any less capable. So I think taking that time to, frankly, take a deep breath, pause, and ask ourselves, is this actually risk that I'm concerned with? Or is this just a perception that I have that's based very much in fear of something changing? And I think in that change, that's an opportunity, not necessarily something to be afraid of.
I love that. I mean, I think that you're hitting the nail on the head. We talk about risk all the time, and we absolutely are concerned for risk. But you've also sort of given us some ways to maneuver around some of those concerns, and again to sort of mitigate some of that risk by looking to some of the other experiences and kind of opening the framework within where we sort of seek out talent. And I think your story kind of speaks to that. With the conversations on race and equity, as well as equality taking center stage currently, what do you think that the future holds on this topic, particularly addressing the wealth gap, economic opportunities, and diversity within the financial sector?
I think I am probably not alone, and my first instinct is to be very cynical, and then I catch myself and I try to think, I tell my clients and try to make it a personal philosophy to think about what I want and not what I don't want. And it's something that I tell my clients too. And in my social media and on my website, you'll never find any of the statistics that we all know about the amount of capital that women get, the amount of capital that people of color get, because there has been so much emphasis on what there is. We've actually kind of lost sight of what we actually want. And if I say, at the end of the day, the least I want is my equal representation in these things. And I think it's a bit simplistic to say that, if Black people make up 13 or 14% of the US population, should probably get 13 to 14% of the capital. And yet, I think that's a very fine place to start. I am very hopeful about the time that we're in. I think this year of any time, perhaps in American history, we've had a moment to take a pause and think about who we are and who we want to be. And what are those opportunities that we've really been missing out on? And I think, I've been overhearing some of the conversations that my husband's firm has been having, and folks have been really happy to have been able to spend more time with their children this year. And obviously that being a very stressful thing with there being homeschooling and all of that. But, really saying, this was a part of their life that I would have missed in this really unfortunate circumstance. This was a little bit of a blessing that I got out of it. And I think the financial services industry can look at it in a very, very similar way of saying, yes, I know we've always thought about these things this way, but how can we start to think about them a little bit differently and create more capital? I think at the end of the day, the more capital that's created, it actually winds up benefiting all of us, not so much in a socialist sense, but I'm thinking even in, if folks have money to start businesses, then they will probably have money to spend in other people's businesses. To me, it's all complete and total common sense that I hope we really start to take a moment to appreciate this opportunity that we've been given instead of being so fearful of it.
We often miss the chance to have an optimistic view when we're focusing on the short-sighted version of reality. So I couldn't agree more. But I would also say that it appears that more and more institutions are realizing the real opportunities here. Recently, we talked about this. NASDAQ announced an initiative to push for greater diversity among the over 3,000 companies listed on their exchange. As a Black woman and one that works within the financial industry, what are your thoughts on this? And what does it mean for the next generation of women and people of color coming into this industry?
Yes, I think I'm also of two minds about this issue as well. On the one hand, I'm absolutely thrilled because that sense of representation needs to be seen. These opportunities need to be hidden. On the other hand, I have the fear of tokenism and that fear of, I think if anything, a woman or a person of color doesn't want to be is the only one. And I know that, the NASDAQ rule is I think it has to be a woman and or a person of color. So it has to be at least two. The problem is that can wind up also being in tokenism. And I've been in jobs where it was me and one other. And frankly, we wound up just calling each other our cellmates because we were the ones who were ostracized together. And on the one hand, it was great to have someone to experience that with. On the other hand, it was all the same result. So part of me is encouraged by it, because at least that means it'll be more opportunities for companies to see the talent that they may not have thought about before. On the other hand, I'm also thinking, I hope that actually does create opportunities. I think another thing that I think about is, there are several women who are on multiple boards. And, I also thrilled to see that Melody Hobson is now the director of the Starbucks board. I think that is phenomenal. And I'm very, very excited and happy for her. But then I also think, wow, I hope this winds up creating more opportunities for more people. And there are Melody and several other women that I can think of very much off the top of my head who wind up getting selected for these roles because we wind up going back to the perceived risk issue. Now that they've been on one, they're now selected for all of them. And it kind of also made me think of, I subscribe to Vogue magazine, and Beyonce has been on the cover of that magazine so many times. And I'm always like, there are other beautiful Black women than Beyonce. There are other smart, talented Black women than these ones who keep getting selected for these board roles. And I don't think it's a matter of, sort of tisk-tisking these women because they're taking opportunities that they very much deserve and should have. And I don't think it's so much that we should pressure them to mentor people or something like that. It's just, really, at the end of the day, I hope what this essentially quota does is encourage companies to find the talent that they already have and to actually acknowledge what's there. And again, perhaps this rule of perceived risk, once you've done it once, you'll no longer be as considered as much risk, will actually help us see that generational shift in which hopefully this will no longer be a conversation as, Gen Z starts to approach their older years, or as Generation Alpha, we won't have to actually have these conversations whatsoever. That's my hope.
Yeah, I think that, that's absolutely a well-made point. We don't want to necessarily see some of these unintended consequences. We want to see a true foundational drive toward creating this path forward. And, Vanetta, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your story today and for all that you are doing to start setting this path forward for others so that we can realize a multitude of financial health and security across every subset of our population. And I just want to thank you again. And I just want to say, very happy holidays to you. Be well, stay safe, and stay connected with us. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me and for all of the work that you're doing. And you don't know how much I appreciate your emphasizing the importance of this issue. So thank you and happy holidays.